Hi, I'm Reverend Jake Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church, located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia, a member congregation of the Confessional Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion, or Aelc for short. So this is my video, Dear LCA, a plea to the Confessionals. This is a video that I'm doing to the so-called confessional Lutherans still within the Lutheran Church of Australia, or LCA for short. Now before I begin, if you notice me looking down or looking to the side, that's because I have notes and I'm be looking at my notes as I'm recording this video. So to begin with, I just want to start with a question to all the confessional Lutherans still within the LCA. And my question is, what is your limit? Seriously, what will it take for you to leave the LCA? See, I often hear people say things like, oh, it's better for us to stay and to reform it. If we leave, we can't fix it. Or other things like, oh, if we leave, it's just going to get worse without us. However, I often hear these same people say things like, oh, if they bring women's ordination in, then I'm gone. And to them, I'm asking, how does women's ordination change this? I mean, the reason you haven't left the LCA now is because your goal is to try and reform it, or because you're worried it's going to get worse when you leave. How does the introduction of women pastors change that? Like, if the LCA starts ordaining women, then wouldn't you still want to stay so that you could change it, reform it? Maybe you could get rid of women pastors. Or, actually more likely, imagine how much worse the LCA will get if all the conservative confessional Lutherans up and leave as soon as women are ordained. Because I guarantee you that as soon as women pastors are brought into the LCA, the next question is going to be homosexual pastors and homosexual marriage. So, if all the people who oppose women's ordination up and leave the LCA, then how soon will it be before the LCA starts ordaining homosexuals or starts marrying homosexuals? It's law in Australia for same-sex weddings, so it is possible for the LCA to adopt that. And so that's why I ask, what is your limit? What will it take for you to leave the LCA? Like, will women's ordination be the issue that makes you leave? Why is that the issue? There are so many other issues already with the LCA. Why is women's ordination the make or break scenario? Why is women's ordination the thing that finally forces you out of the LCA? And the better question is, will it? Will women's ordination actually force you out of the LCA? I often hear all these people talk about this big break and this big exodus of confessionals from the LCA as soon as women pastors are ordained. But why? And what gives you this guarantee that that's going to happen? I mean, let's look at history for a moment. Back in 1966, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Australia, or Aelc, and the United Evangelical Lutheran Church in Australia, or Uelc, united to form the current LCA. Now, there were many pastors and laity and congregations that were worried about this union, particularly those in the Aelc, because the Uelc was a bit more progressive and liberal. And so the Aelc pastors and congregations feared that if they united, the Uelc would corrupt this new LCA church body. And there was a number of pastors and congregations that protested it. There were particularly 13 pastors that took a big stand against the union. They opposed the union, fought against the union, did not want the union to happen. And yet, when the union actually took place, only 2 of these 13 pastors actually left. One of those is Pastor Kurt Marquardt, who went back to America to the Missouri Synod, and the other was Pastor Frederick Kleinig, who started the small Evangelical Lutheran Congregations of the Reformation, or ELCR for short. Those other pastors that had opposed the union and had said things like, oh, if the churches unite, we're not going to, we're going to stay separate. those other pastors didn't. They stayed in the LCA. And several of those pastors, Pastor Clarence Prebino, Pastor Vernon Grieger, and Pastor Melvin Grieger, who had protested the union back in the 1960s, ended up splitting from the LCA in the 1990s. And yet again, there were many pastors who supported them. And during the 1980s, when there was the big inerrancy debate within the LCA, there were many who were on the same side as Pastor Prebino and the Pastor Griegers. Yet when the time came to split, only a handful actually did. Many of the others who were opposing what the LCA were doing just stayed in the LCA. And so, if history repeats itself, I see no reason why there will be a mass exodus of confessionals out of the LCA as soon as women's ordination is brought in. There are many pastors who oppose women's ordination, and many congregations and laity, and they speak out vocally against it. And they often say things like, oh, if they bring it in, we're leaving. Yet in reality, how many of them will actually leave the LCA? Because I think that those who actually leave the LCA are going to be a much smaller number. And this is what makes me ask people, what will it take for you to leave? What if your pastor in your congregation doesn't leave the LCA? Like, I often hear people say things like, I know the LCA's got bad teaching. I know the LCA's got bad practice. I know there's false teachers and bad things going on in LCA, but I've got a confessional pastor. My congregation is still a confessional congregation. Well, firstly, I question the confessionalism of your congregation if you're continuing to have fellowship with those who unrepentantly teach false doctrines. But that's a discussion for another day. That's a discussion on the proper practice of church fellowship. My question to you is, what if your confessional Lutheran pastor and your confessional congregation doesn't leave the LCA as soon as women's ordination comes in? For example, I can guarantee you there'll be many congregations who stay in the LCA and say things like, we just won't ever call a female. We'll stay part of the LCA. We'll try and reform it. We'll stop it from getting any worse. We'll just never call a female. And so you're still in the LCA. And this makes me ask you, what will it take for you to leave? I look at many confessionals in the LCA, and it's like watching a victim of domestic violence. There's this thing called battered wife syndrome, where generally the victim of domestic violence can't get up the nerve to leave. And they often say things like, oh, but deep down, I know he really loves me, or I can change him, I can fix him. You know, one day he will care for me and we'll have a happy marriage. And when I hear the confessionals in the LCA say things like, oh, we can reform it, or it would be worse if we left, you sound like a victim of domestic violence that can't leave their abusive partner. You know what's wrong. You know this isn't right. And yet you keep convincing yourself that you should stay because it would be better if you stayed. But the truth is, it would be better if you left. You could do more if you could leave. Break fellowship with the heterodox. Show them that their false teaching has consequences. Show them that if they're going to promote these false doctrines, that you will leave them. Show them that the only way to have true church fellowship is to have agreement and to teach what the Bible and the confessions actually teach. We need to show them that they can't keep promoting this false doctrine and continue to have fellowship with us. Continuing to have fellowship with those who teach falsely is like being an enabler for a drug addict. They crave the drug and so you give it to them. You're just making things worse. You're not actually fixing the problem. But I return to my initial question as to what is your limit? See, women's ordination is not the only false thing going on in the LCA. I have a short list of issues I have with the LCA. See, I left the LCA because I could not hold to the official teachings of the LCA. Again, I often hear people say things like, oh, the LCA's official teachings are good, it's just the practice and particular few teachers and pastors that are saying the wrong thing. But the actual official public teaching of the LCA is all correct and spot on, therefore I'll stay in the LCA. Now, again, that's a discussion for another time about the idea of orthodoxy and orthopraxy, like should doctrine and practice, should doctrine and practice actually go hand in hand and reflect each other? Again, that's a discussion for another time. But for this video, what is more important to point out is that the LCA's official public teachings aren't all good. They aren't all in agreement with Scripture and the Lutheran confessions. And so I have a short list of just a few things that I have issue with the teachings of the LCA. The first one is their rejection of the Lutheran doctrine that the Pope is the Antichrist. The Lutheran Church, in their official Lutheran Catholic dialogue, has rejected the teaching that the Pope is the Antichrist. Instead, the Lutheran Church says, oh, historically, some popes have been Antichrist, but not the current Pope. Not only is that going against the Lutheran confessions, that's not even the Lutherans' understanding of the Pope being the Antichrist. The Antichrist is not the Antichrist because of some immoral life or some unholy thing that he's done. The Lutheran teaching on the Antichrist is the Pope is the Antichrist because he puts himself in the place of Christ. He makes himself the head of the church. He makes salvation dependent on fellowship with him. And so whether he is a morally upright Pope or a morally depraved Pope, he's still the Antichrist because of the office. This is why it's sometimes more accurate to say we don't say a Pope is the Antichrist. We say the papal office is the Antichrist. The Antichrist is not a single individual, but the office of Pope. And so by saying that some historical popes were Antichrist, but the current Pope isn't, the LCA has gone against the Lutheran confessions. They are no longer a confessional Lutheran church as soon as they start rejecting the teachings of the Lutheran confessions. And this is an official public document that is held by the Lutheran Church of Australia, and every member and pastor of the Lutheran Church of Australia says that they agree with that document. It is an official public teaching of the LCA that the Pope is not the Antichrist. And that's just one of many. There's also the LCA's loose position on divorce, allowing divorce for cases other than just adultery. The LCA's soft approach to evolution. If you read the LCA's position on creation evolution, it's their statement on Genesis chapters 1 through to 3, the LCA essentially says something along the lines of, our official teaching is that we hold to six-day creation, a historical six-day creation. However, if anyone holds to evolution and doesn't hold to a literal historical six-day creation, we won't condemn them. So what's the point of having an official position if you're saying everyone else can just hold a different position anyway? Also, the LCA has a very vague statement on inerrancy. See, someone like myself could read the LCA's statements on inerrancy and go, this sounds good. But progressive liberal people that don't believe in absolute inerrancy could also read those same statements and have no problem with them. This is because the LCA's statements on inerrancy are very vague. Now, the statement in the Thesis of Agreement was very well, but the more recent statements, such as the consensus statement, take a much more vague approach. And I was actually taught this at the Lutheran Seminary by the lecturers, that when the LCA says we believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, that it doesn't mean absolute inerrancy, as in historical and geographical inerrancy, but only theological inerrancy. Therefore, you can have people in the LCA who can say, I believe in the inerrancy of Scripture, but I don't believe creation happened, or I don't believe that Jonah was inside a whale, or I don't believe David was a true person, or I don't believe some of the miracles Jesus did. There is no inerrancy if you just say, you can reject what the Bible teaches. That's not inerrant. It's either absolute inerrancy or there is no inerrancy. Next, there's just the issue of women in the church. So for example, everyone complains about women's ordination, but the LCA sacrificed the principle of women in the church back in the 90s when they started to allow lay women to do things in the church that historically were reserved for lay men. So in the LCA, a female layperson can help in the distribution of the Lord's Supper, can read the Bible lessons, can lead a lay reading service, and preach a sermon that is being prepared by a pastor as part of a lay reading service. The only things a female layperson can't do are the same things that a male layperson can't do, such as baptism, absolution, Holy Communion, and writing their own sermons. Otherwise, a female layperson can do everything else. And so, I, for one, believe that those passages in the scripture that talk about women remaining silent in the church and women submitting to men and not having authority over men in the church is not speaking merely about the office of the ministry, but is talking about women and men in general in the church. Therefore, women shouldn't be serving in the church in any capacity like this. Now, there are other issues that I find with the Lutheran Church of Australia, such as them allowing lay people to do things that I think should be reserved for the office of the ministry, or the LCA's teaching that you can just pour out the leftover consecrated elements rather than consuming them. However, those are more issues that, like myself and my church, the Aelc, take issue with. Whereas there are many people in Australia I know wouldn't find issue with that. But I think those same people will find problem with the fact that the LCA doesn't hold absolutely to the Lutheran confessions and that they have a vague teaching on inerrancy. These are issues that all Lutherans should be troubled by, not just the Aelc, not just the other non-LCA synods, but all the Lutherans in Australia. They should take issue with this fact. And so I ask you, what will it take for you to leave? Because what I have just talked about are the official public teachings of the LCA. By being a member of the LCA and saying that you hold to the official teachings of the LCA means that you no longer believe the current Pope is the Antichrist and all the other teachings that the LCA promote. It's not just a few individuals. By being a member of the Lutheran Church of Australia, you are subscribing to these official public teachings of the LCA. And they are not in accordance with the scriptures of the Book of Concord. And that is why I left. And that is why I'm encouraging other confessional Lutherans who do hold to the scriptures in the Book of Concord to see that the LCA is not a confessional Lutheran church, that the LCA is not a biblical church, that the LCA is a heterodox church, and that you should flee it and seek fellowship with the Orthodox. And so now you may ask me, well, where will I go, Jake? Where can I go? Now you're probably assuming me to say something like, oh, come and join the Aelc, come and join my church. But this may be a surprise, but that's not what I'm here to say. See, my goal is not to just promote and grow the Aelc. Of course, I would love to see the Aelc grow. But there are many people in the LCA that I don't think would agree with the Aelc teachings. And so they wouldn't fit in with the Aelc. See, this is the reason why I think it's also troubling when people have this idea that if women's ordination comes in, there'll be this massive split and all the confessional congregations and pastors will just go and form some new confessional Lutheran church. The problem with that is that there are many people who oppose women's ordination who don't agree with each other. There are pastors in the LCA who oppose women's ordination, but don't believe in a six-day creation. There are pastors in the LCA who oppose women's ordination, but don't believe in an absolute inerrancy. There are some pastors in the LCA who oppose women's ordination and hold to charismatic Pentecostal doctrines. If all those pastors were to unite and form some new synod based purely on the idea that they all oppose women's ordination, then they're just going to split and have more fights later on. Because they can't all agree on whether Scripture is inerrant. They can't all agree on whether Pentecostalism is good or bad. They can't all agree on whether the world was created in 6 days or not. The only thing they can agree upon is that women shouldn't be pastors. Some of them would also be quite happy with women not being pastors, but with lay women doing stuff in the church, whereas other pastors and congregations don't want women doing anything in the church. How can all these pastors and congregations go and form some new synod when they can't even agree? And so I'm not telling everyone to come and join the Aelc, because many of you won't agree with the teachings of the Aelc. What I am saying is I think it's about time that you wake up and realize the error of the LCA and that you leave the LCA. That you flee from the false teachers and that you go and seek fellowship with the Orthodox churches. And so what I'm actually going to suggest is that you join one of the non-LCA Lutheran synods. Go and find a church that you do agree with, whether that's the Aelc, whether that's the ELCR, whether it's one of the other non-LCA churches. I would encourage you to seek them out, talk to them and see if you agree with them rather than staying in the LCA. And so I'm going to give you a list of churches that you could go to if you left the LCA. For over the last few years, I have become the leading researcher into the non-LCA Lutheran churches of Australia. I've researched their history, I have contact with these churches, and I know their current statements of faith and positions on matters. So if you're looking for a church to go to after leaving the LCA, contact me and ask me, hey, which church would I be best suited for? You can contact me via Facebook, or you can email me at revjakezabel@hotmail.com and just contact me and say, hey, Pastor Jake, I agree with you and I'm going to leave the LCA. I believe these things. Where should I go now? And so I'm going to give you a list of the different non-LCA Lutheran churches in Australia. And I'm going to break these into two groups. Those who have a looser position on church fellowship and those who have a stricter view on church fellowship. So there are many churches like the Aelc that have closed communion. And so we won't commune you or welcome you in as members unless you agree with us. There are, however, a few churches that practice what's known as selective fellowship. So this isn't open communion, but it's like a selective closed communion. So we're not going to close it to everybody. We will open it to some people who aren't members, but we will keep it closed to some people who aren't members. And so the churches that have selective fellowship are the Growth Lutheran Network, or GLN for short. They're located mainly in Perth, Australia, in Western Australia. Then there is also what I call the Independents. This is a collection of independent pastors and congregations that had split from the Aelc church. They are located kind of around Australia, mainly in southeast Queensland, the Barossa Valley and the Adelaide Hills. There is also then the Aletheia Lutheran Church. This was a synod that has formed from a mission started by Chris Roseborough of the Aelc in America. Aletheia is a largely online Lutheran church. They practice online communion, so they'll be able to, if you agree with them, they'll be able to serve you communion wherever you are in the world. So they're not really so much located to particular areas. I mean, there are places where their members live and worship, but they also have a much bigger online presence. So these are the three main groups that have a selective fellowship. Now, as for those churches that have closed communion and have thus stricter views on church fellowship, I'm going to start with the churches that people probably are less likely to go to if they leave the LCA, and then I'll move into the church bodies I think people leaving the LCA are more likely to join. So the first group I'm going to mention is the CLC, or the Church of Lutheran Confessions. So they have a single house church here in Australia located in the Barossa Valley. That's down there. They're a very small church. It's a house church in the Barossa Valley. Their main body, the CLC, is based in America. The next church body is the Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Church, or OELC. They are scattered kind of around southeast Queensland. They have a bunch of little house churches, but they have no pastor. Their pastor passed away within the last decade, and they have a lot of lay people doing stuff in the church, and they have never ordained a new person or saw a need really to get another pastor, so they don't really have any pastors serving in their church. Next is the ELCR, the Evangelical Lutheran Congregations of the Reformation. And the reason I'm putting them in this list of kind of churches that I don't think people leaving the LCA would go to is because they're kind of very legalistic and pietistic. They have a mandate that women have to wear head coverings. They're very strict. They're the stereotypical no dancing, no drinking, da-da-da-da-da. So I doubt people leaving the LCA would like to go and join the ELCR. So they're there, they're available. They're located mostly in southeast Queensland, although they have a congregation in Melbourne and also some house churches, missions in Adelaide and Tasmania. So they're around the place. And if you want to join them, feel free. If you want to at least talk to them, feel free. I'd encourage you at least talk to them. But I kind of feel that many people leaving the LCA wouldn't fit with the LCR. So lastly, there are 4 groups that I'd like to recommend people check out. There's the Australian Evangelical Lutheran Church, or AELC. This group is based largely in southeast Queensland. How someone would understand them is that they're kind of like an old Missouri style church. If you think of the Missouri Synod's 1932 statement, that's essentially kind of what the AELC is. They're like an old, early 1900s Missouri. Not probably, I mean, I think early 1900s Missouri was a little bit pietistic in some places, and the AELC isn't. But doctrine-wise, the AELC is kind of very similar to Missouri Synod before Missouri Synod started to allow women to do stuff in the church and stuff like that. So if you like the Missouri Synod, the church that you're probably most likely to join would probably be the AELC. The next group I'd recommend is the ELSA, or Evangelical Lutheran Synod of Australia. So they have a congregation in Maryborough. There is also a congregation they're in fellowship with in Brisbane at Petrie. This congregation is not a member of the ELSA, but is in fellowship with the ELSA. It's kind of a mission church of the ELS, or Evangelical Lutheran Synod in the USA. So the ELSA is in full fellowship with the Wells, or Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod. So for those people who might like the Wisconsin Lutheran Church rather than the Missouri Lutheran Church, should seek out the ELSA. Now the next 2 churches are my own, the Aelc, which I'll get to lastly, and St. Jude, the Apostle Lutheran Church located in Melbourne. Now our churches are very close in doctrine. The only thing we disagree on is the question of private prayer fellowship. So our church does allow private prayer fellowship with people who aren't members of our church. So I will pray table grace with people who aren't members of the Aelc. Whereas the St. Jude, the Apostle Lutheran Church, doesn't have private prayer fellowship with people who aren't members of their church. So otherwise, we tend to agree in most other doctrines. So our churches are much more high church Lutheran. We have a high view of the sacrament, a high view of the ministry, a high view of the liturgy. I like to tell people we're somewhat like the Aldona, or Evangelical Lutheran Diocese of North America, although not quite. There are a number of things that we and the Aldona disagree on. For example, women's suffrage. The Aldona has no problem with women voting in the church, whereas the Aelc does. And another of other issues such as the view on election and stuff like that. Actually, the Aelc's position on election is very close to the LCA's position on election, and that our statement on election was based largely off of the LCA's thesis of agreement on the doctrine of election. So we're pretty close there. One thing I do tell people often is that, oh, we're very similar with Aldona on the question of objective justification. However, that's not entirely accurate. The Aelc likes to take a kind of a middle position between the Kokomo theses of the Wells and the kind of strict rejection of any form of objective justification as promoted by the Aldona. We're kind of a midway position where we reject certain articulations of universal objective justification, like that expressed in the Kokomo theses of the Wells. However, we don't reject all forms and explanations of the term universal objective justification. Again, this is a discussion for another time, but we're kind of a midway position between Wells and Aldona. So I do have a little diagram on Facebook where I've got a triangle of Missouri at the top, Aldona on the left, Wells on the right, and then the Aelc in the middle, because we find that middle ground between Wells, Missouri, and Aldona. So yeah, the Aelc is probably for those people that like Missouri. The ELSA is for those people that like the Wells, and the Aelc is kind of in between Wells, Missouri, and Aldona. So if you're thinking of leaving the LCA, I would encourage you to contact me and I'll help you find a church that best suits you. But most importantly, I would just like to encourage people to leave the LCA. And I know some people are going to say, it's unloving for me to say this. It's unloving for me to call the LCA heterodox. But true biblical Christian love warns people when they're in error. And it warns people when they belong to a church that is in error. It is more loving for me to warn you than to allow you to continue belonging to a church that is heterodox. I mean, what I have said is nothing new. The position on church fellowship that I promote is not something new. It's the historical Lutheran position on church fellowship. It's a position held by Luther and Chemnitz in the church and the Lutheran Church Fathers. It's a position held by Walther and Pieper and Sasser and Marquette and the Old Synodical Conference, and it is actually the official position of the current Missouri Synod, even though often there are cases where Missouri congregations don't follow the official practice of the Missouri Synod. The official teaching of the Missouri Synod is this strict view of closed communion and that we should break fellowship with the heterodox, that we shouldn't have fellowship with those who are in error. So what I'm saying is nothing new. It's the true historical confessional Lutheran view to break fellowship with the heterodox and to seek fellowship with the Orthodox. And the Lutheran Church of Australia is a heterodox church. Not only individuals, not only congregations, but the official public teaching of the LCA says things that are contrary to Scripture and contrary to the Lutheran confessions. I think the confessional Orthodox Lutherans still within the LCA should break fellowship with the heterodox pastors and congregations because the leadership is failing to practice any form of discipline and to discipline those who teach contrary to the LCA teachings. But even more so, there are problematic public official teachings of the LCA. And I don't agree with those teachings. And that is why I left the LCA. And I am encouraging all those other true confessional Lutherans who still reside in the LCA. If you disagree with these teachings of the LCA, you too should leave. I mean, if you agree with those public teachings of the LCA, then your confessionalism is in question. But if you truly hold to the Scriptures, and you truly hold to the Book of Concord, then you will see that the LCA is a heterodox church and that it is not in agreement with the Bible or the Book of Concord. And so I'm going to end my video here with these words. I plead to the true confessional Orthodox members of the LCA. Look at the doctrines of the LCA. Look at the practices of the LCA. Go and study Walther and Pieper and Sasa and Luther and learn about a true confessional position on church fellowship. And then leave the LCA. Leave this heterodox church body. Leave this abusive partner. And seek out fellowship with the Orthodox. Goodbye, and God bless. This is my video, Dear LCA, a plea to the confessionals.